very much, and I really appreciate having this opportunity to be here tonight and be in Elmira at Quarry Farm. It's one of my favorite places, and I can't thank Joe and the center enough for the support that he gives scholars in general, but especially independent scholars who are outside of academia. So, as I said, it's a labor of love, and this place really helps to support that, and I really appreciate it. And I appreciate you all coming out tonight as well. And what I wanted to do...
The mic.
Into the mic?
Yep.
Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. Sorry about that. As I said, I'm an independent scholar. I don't usually have microphones in my face. So, but what I wanted to do to get things started tonight, just as a point of curiosity for myself, but just wanted to see how many people here think Mark Twain was an get this. Oh, there we go. Who here thinks Mark Twain was a lifelong atheist? Okay, that's good. How about he became an atheist over time? Okay, we got a couple. That's good. But what about those who think he was never an atheist? Okay, that's good to see that there's a nice variety and some who are not so sure, and hopefully I'll have some things to say tonight that will give you some food for thought at least. So in the mid-1990s, when I began my master's thesis on Mark Twain and religion, at that time I was something of an outlier. The dominant view at that time seemed to be that Twain was an atheist. A lot of scholars, a lot of lay people thought that. At the very least, many saw him as an irreligious skeptic who grew increasingly hostile toward religion over his lifetime. Now that assumption may not be as pervasive as it is now, but it stubbornly persists. Here are some examples. Atheists often embrace Twain as one of their own, but some Christian evangelicals also agree with them. An episode of a Christian podcast in 2014 entitled "The Dreadful Legacy of Mark Twain" described the humorist as the founding father of American skepticism, anti-Christian sentiment, and strangely enough, American high school literature. And this view is also found in the mainstream media. The Hartford Current in 2002 summed up Twain as the comic village atheist who took a one-way trip to the dark side and became a homegrown Friedrich Nietzsche, or a proto-existentialist bemoaning being and nothingness. It's quite a mouthful. Yeah. A key factor, of course, in forming this view is the unavoidable fact that religion was a favorite target of Mark Twain as a humorist. In his breakthrough publication, The Innocents Abroad, Twain took frequent potshots at religion, like when he dismissed some sacred sites he saw in the Holy Land as imaginary holy places created by the monks. Now today, that may seem like a pretty harmless jab, but one outraged minister at the time scolded Twain from the pulpit for ridiculing sacred scenes and things, while another even went so far as to call him this son of the devil, Mark Twain. And of course, the sharp edge of his satirical skepticism cuts through most of his work, right up to his infamous Letters from the Earth, an unfinished draft from 1909 that features Satan as its narrator and contains some of Twain's most biting critiques of God and Christianity. However, the most significant text contributing to Mark Twain's irreligious reputation has to be, in my opinion, The Mysterious Stranger, a romance. This was published in 1916, 6 years after Twain's death, and it's an odd tale that follows the visit of Satan's nephew to a 16th century Austrian village called Esseldorf, which literally means Assville. There, the satanic stranger befriends a group of boys, including the story's narrator, Theodore. Along with depicting the tyrannical church as corrupt and hypocritical, The book concludes with the stranger revealing to Theodore that nothing exists. All is a dream. God, man, the world, they have no existence. He then leaves the appalled narrator alone as a, quote, homeless thought wandering forlorn among the empty eternities, unquote. So not surprisingly, this book casts a long, dark shadow over nearly 50 years of scholarship after its publication. In 1962, Henry Nash Smith summed up the scholarly consensus at the time when he observed that by the time Twain wrote The Mysterious Stranger, he could, quote, no longer find any meaning in man or society. Twain's only refuge in the end, according to Smith, was to identify with a supernatural spectator for whom mankind is but a race of vermin, hardly worth contempt. And in concluding with somber finality, Smith declared that this marks the end of Twain's career as a writer, for there is nothing more to say. So, it would appear as though The Mysterious Stranger decisively proves what so many still assume today to be true. Twain was a nihilistic atheist and a bitter foe of religion. So thank you and good night. That's the end of my As it turned out, Henry Nash Smith's conclusion in 1962 would prove to be a bit premature, if not greatly exaggerated. A year later, a scholar by the name of John Tuckey discovered that The Mysterious Stranger, a romance, was not exactly Twain's version. It's a very long and somewhat complicated story, and I won't try to get into all the details of it tonight, but to give you an overview, Tuckey discovered that Twain actually worked on 3 distinctly different Mysterious Stranger manuscripts between 1897 and 1909. One was Chronicle of Young Satan, if you can't, I hope you can read all of that. The other was Schoolhouse Hill, and the last one was number 44, The Mysterious Stranger. And Twain abandoned the first 2 unfinished drafts by 1900. Both deal with an otherworldly visitor who identifies as Satan's nephew in Chronicle and as Satan's son in Schoolhouse Hill. Chronicle, in my opinion, is the darker of the 2, which is understandable to me because Twain began it while still grieving the unexpected death of his daughter Susie. The story, Chronicle of Young Satan, is set in Esseldorf, and it involves a malevolent, in my opinion, satanic stranger, seemingly hell-bent on destroying the moral sense of the young narrator named Theodore, whose name, incidentally, means gift of God. The shorter and more positive Schoolhouse Hill is set in Huck and Tom's frontier hometown. It involves a stranger who claims he was raised partly in heaven, partly in hell, and he's visiting Earth now to make amends for the damage caused by his fallen father. Apparently, from notes that Twain left behind, he was planning to have him start a new religion. Number 44, which Twain worked on the longest from 1902 to 1909, is the only finished draft of these 3. It's the only one containing The Mysterious Stranger as part of its title. That's the title Twain gave it. As the most unique of the 3, the stranger here never claims he has any connection at all with Satan. Also set in Esseldorf, this version takes place in 1490 in a place called the Castle Rosenfeld within Esseldorf. And in this version, there's a young narrator named August, and he befriends the affable stranger who yearns to be comrades with him. Now, number 44 is the only original draft that has the concluding chapter where the stranger reveals that nothing exists. However, read in its proper context, and as the conclusion of this version, of Twain's original version, the concluding chapter doesn't have the same bleak conclusion to it that the 1916 version does. In this version, it's the same chapter, but it leads up thematically to a whole different conclusion, and it seems a bit more positive. 44 ultimately seems to liberate August from the insane dreams and fictions clogging his consciousness, and he leaves him empowered to, quote, dream other dreams and better. So essentially, John Tuckey's detective work revealed that The Mysterious Stranger, a romance, was a patchwork of Twain's original 3, or mainly 2, original works. Some have gone so far as to call it a literary fraud. Others disagree with that, but in any case, after Twain's death in 1910, this is basically what happened. His literary executor, what do you know what I'm saying? Albert Bigelow Payne, and an editor from HarperCollins, Frederick Dunica, took number 44's original chapter, the final chapter, and put it onto the unfinished version of Chronicle of Young Satan. They changed the title, of course, and they made up a new character. There's a character now that Twain didn't write about called the astrologer, and they added some of their own text and extensively edited Twain's original work. Now, John Tuckey's discovery led him to question Twain's reputation as a despairing atheist. He observed, certainly Mark Twain is no more consistently hopeless in the later years than he was consistent about most other things. And he had his exuberances and enthusiasm right on through. Unfortunately, Tuckey never finished a book that he was working on that may have reinterpreted Twain's unorthodox religious views in a more positive light. And despite his groundbreaking discovery that brought new light to what the Twain's actual Mysterious Stranger works were really like, and the scholarship that has generated in the years since the 1960s, I have the impression that number 44, The Mysterious Stranger, seems to be largely unknown among the general readers. And just as another point of curiosity, has anyone read number 44, The Mysterious Stranger? Okay, that reaffirms what my thoughts are. Sometimes when we used to have bookstores, I would go into bookstores to the Twain section just to see, and they would always have the 1916 version most of the time, and often didn't have the number 44 version, just as a anecdotal thing there. As Tuckey observed, if Mark Twain's surviving spirit has the human scene in view, the prank-loving humorist is probably enjoying the resulting confusion. But this confusion has enabled the false, in my opinion, the false assumption that Twain was an atheist to persist. It's this stubborn assumption that I hope to counterbalance with my book, There Is No Humor in Heaven. And I don't claim that this is going to be a definitive take on Mark Twain and we can just all stop talking about his views on religion. This is, as I said, counterbalancing maybe some of the more dominant assumptions that he was an atheist. So the book's main thrust is that Mark Twain, far from being an embittered atheist, was not only a lifelong believer in what he called the deity, but he was actively engaged with the religious ethos of his day, religious liberalism. And the title is from Twain's observation that the secret source of humor itself is not joy, but sorrow. There is no humor in heaven. Now, I assert that Twain's biting satire of religious orthodoxy, dogmatism, and superstition actually has more in common with liberal theology's critiques of traditional Christianity than it does with atheism. In fact, I believe his calling as a humorist to, quote, excite the laughter of God's children in this sorrowful world was deeply aligned with religious liberalism's this worldly focus. Now, to show this, what I do in my book is I look at the close friendships that Twain had with several prominent liberal ministers and the influence they had on his writing and beliefs. Twain may have, and certainly did, delight in provoking Orthodox ministers into condemning him as a son of the devil, But he also enjoyed the company of his era's most influential liberal ministers. As Twain reflected, "It is only the small fry ministers who assail me. All those of high rank and real influence I visit, dine, and swap lies with, just the same as ever." A key premise of my book is that Twain was not merely friends with these liberal ministers, but as a frustrated preacher of the gospel himself, he shared a deep affinity with their vocation as preachers. He admitted as much near the end of his life when he said, "I have always preached. If the humor came of its own accord and uninvited, I have allowed it a place in my sermon. But I was not writing the sermon for the sake of humor." But essentially, I show how sermons by Twain's theologically liberal friends influenced his humorous sermons, as well as his ever-evolving religious beliefs. This influence follows Twain throughout his life, from Hannibal to Hawaii, where various heterodox views and liberal ministers influenced Twain's calling as a humorist, and from the Holy Land to Hartford, where varieties of liberal Christianity influenced Innocents Abroad and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, from Hartford to the Himalayas, where free religion, and in particular, this might be surprising to some, Hinduism influenced Twain's later years, and arriving finally at an empty and soundless world where I reinterpret Letters from the Earth and number 44, The Mysterious Stranger, through a liberal religious lens. Now, for the rest of my presentation, I'll offer some brief insights from the book I'm working on. But first, what do I mean by liberal religion? The term covers a variety of 19th century Christian theologies, as well as radical free religion, and even a form of what I would call religious atheism, mostly forgotten today. Now, religious philosopher Max Muller, whom Twain read and thought highly of, defined this kind of atheism as the very lifeblood of all truth and faith, my emphasis. It is the power of giving up what, in our best and most honest moments, we know to be no longer true. Without that atheism, no new religion, that's my emphasis as well, no reform, no reformation, no resuscitation would ever have been possible. Without that atheism, no new life is possible for any of us. So, liberal religion, as I'm defining it, was a broad theological movement that mainly emerged from the Enlightenment. It placed religious tradition and scripture under rigorous analytical scrutiny, and especially here in America, it reinterpreted Christianity to create a progressive religious alternative to atheistic rationalism on the one hand and to theologies based on external authority on the other. Many religious liberals also focused on individuals having a first-hand experience of God rather than here and now, rather than the by and by. And many of them were also hoping to liberate religion itself from what they considered to be irrational traditional authority. Now, the broad range of views contained within religious liberalism included devout liberal Christians who wanted to keep their faith relevant amid the scientific and industrial revolutions of the 19th century. And there were Unitarians who at that time, most of them, were liberal Christians as well, but they were much more open to world religions as well as their Christian faith. And then there was the free religion end of the spectrum, which left the search for religious meaning up to the individual. I've highlighted here major religious thinkers like Bushnell, Parker, and Emerson, who influenced Twain's ministerial friends, Joe Twitchell, Thomas Starr King, and Moncure Conway. In particular, there are many others than just those three. As these theological differences suggest, Twain, in my opinion, oscillated across its spectrum throughout his lifetime. From the Unitarians he met on the Western frontier in California, and the liberal Christianity of Olivia Langdon and her family, to the free religion espoused by his friend, the radical Emerson protege, Moncure Conway. The literary impact of liberal religion on 19th century America also was an important influence on Mark Twain. Unitarian ministers in particular were at the vanguard of what was considered a time of striking innovation and creativity in preaching. Because they were not bound by orthodox forms of preaching, Unitarians were freer to integrate more worldly sensibilities and more artistic and literary aesthetics into their sermons. And this would have an influence on Whitman, Melville, Hawthorne, Emerson, and I would argue the literary sermons by Mark Twain. So on both a personal and a literary level, I think Twain's religious critiques were shaped by religious liberalism. You can see in these two quotes that a liberal religious sensibility followed him and infused his thinking throughout his life. The first is from the 1860s, religion that comes of thought and study and deliberate conviction sticks best. And the second is from near the end of his life, when he jadedly criticizes the second-hand beliefs people get from those whose opinion is not worth a brass farthing. So the roots of this perspective actually extend back to Twain's youth in Hannibal. Although he attended a Presbyterian church there as a child, scholars like Alexander Jones have pointed out several heterodox influences in Hannibal, particularly in Twain's family. I hope you can see his father was a free thinker, his uncle a universalist, his brother was an abolitionist and was very unorthodox in his Christianity. And Jones also noted that the influence of religious liberalism is found in the hymnals, in the books, in the hymnals of the church that Twain attended. And as a cub riverboat pilot, Twain read Thomas Paine's deistic Age of Reason, and he joined the Masonic Lodge in St. Louis, which largely consisted of riverboat pilots. So these various heterodox currents would only deepen when Twain went out west with his brother Orion after the Civil War began. Orion's reward for campaigning for Lincoln in the 1860 election was to be assigned as Secretary of the Nevada Territory. And during this time there, and later in San Francisco, Twain befriended numerous Freemasons and prominent liberal clergy known for their popular and literary style of preaching. Samuel Clemens may have been born in Missouri, but his famous alter ego, Mark Twain, came to life in California and on the frontier amid the friendships he had with those men. And I make the case in my book that this is more than just a coincidence. When Twain told his brother in 1865 that he was going to be a humorist, he framed it in terms of religious vocation. Twain admitted that aside from wanting to be a riverboat pilot, his only, quote, powerful ambition had been to be a preacher of the gospel. What thwarted this ambition was what Twain called ordained ministry stock in trade, i.e. religion. So some scholars see the ironic distinction that Twain makes here between the gospel and religion as an early indication of his emerging atheism, the absurdity of being called to something that he can't really believe in, ultimately. But when you understand that Twain wrote this letter at a time when he was friends with numerous liberal ministers who also made a distinction between the gospel and institutional religion, a different interpretation is possible. In an influential sermon from 1841, Unitarian Theodore Parker preached that the real Christianity Jesus taught was not a system of doctrines, but the living Word of God, which is mainly why Jesus ran up against the religious establishment in his day. So as such, what Jesus taught, according to Parker, would endure forever, while what men called Christianity would only remain uncertain and transient. At least 3 of Twain's friends on the western frontier would illustrate what this distinction means in actual ministerial practice. I've listed the three here. Reverend Franklin Rising was a, quote, radical, unquote, Episcopalian minister Twain met in Nevada. Reverend Rising was there also as a member of the American Church Missionary Society, founded in 1860 to preach the gospel based on the moderate and liberal principles, quote unquote, of their church. And what they meant by the gospel was a Christianity stripped of what Parker called a system of doctrines. As such, Reverend Rising preached, quote, the simple, fundamental life truths of Christianity with little symbol, ritual, and legal forms. Another aspect of liberal Christianity that was a big influence here was higher criticism, which was a method of literary and historical analysis that many proponents of liberal religion would use in their attempt to discern who the historical Jesus really was and what the simple fundamental life truths he taught were beyond what tradition and scripture have told us. Two prominent Unitarian ministers Twain befriended in San Francisco were deeply influenced by higher criticism. Reverend Thomas Starr King, whose mentor was Theodore Parker, was an immensely popular preacher in San Francisco. Not only was King credited with keeping California in the Union during the Civil War, his captivating sermons were known for their literary style and earthy humor. Twain described Reverend Henry Bellows as a, quote, man of imperial intellect and matchless power. He is Christian in the truest sense of the term. And known for his sophistication and higher criticism and a spirituality of humor, Bellows was the editor of the Christian Examiner, an important Unitarian literary journal. And he was such a big fan of Twain's writing at the time that he encouraged the aspiring humorist to write a book. So it's likely that the liberal theology of these literary-minded ministers influenced Twain. And I find many examples of this sensibility sprinkled throughout The Innocents Abroad, such as when Twain, in my opinion, uses an aspect of higher criticism to speculate on what it was like for Jesus when he was a child. Did he romp around with his brothers? Did he fight with them over toys, etc.? And one line of interest here that will become of more relevance later is Twain's reference to Jesus as a, quote, mysterious stranger who was God. I'll just leave that hanging in the air for a second. Liberal Christian ministers would also play a significant role as Mark Twain rose to fame as an author. When he was courting Olivia Langdon here in Elmira and later settled in Hartford after they were married, Twain became lifelong friends with Reverend Joseph Twitchell and Reverend Thomas Beecher, both of whom co-officiated his and Livy's wedding ceremony. It's probably common knowledge, I would imagine, that Beecher was highly unconventional and very independently minded as a Christian minister. And although Twitchell is sometimes, not always, but sometimes considered a little dull and conventional in his beliefs, his parishioner, Charles Dudley Warner, noted that Twitchell has given much study and thought to the discussions that have shaken the Christian world. He is of a liberal and receptive mind, but he has kept through it all a perfectly level head. Both ministers were protégés of Horace Bushnell, a controversial liberal Christian whom Twain considered the greatest clergyman of the 19th century. Called the Emerson of Hartford by some, Bushnell was brought up twice on charges of heresy. He was exonerated both times for his heterodox theology. He shared with Emerson an emphasis on mystical intuition and instinctive spirituality over orthodox creeds and dogmas. He also thought the Trinity was a metaphorical representation of the Godhead, but not a literal truth. He also stated that divinity was within humanity and nature, not apart from them, and that Christian character evolves from long-time nurturing relationships, not dramatic conversion experiences. However, unlike Emerson, Bushnell hoped his theological liberalism would keep Christ's gospel vital and relevant in a rapidly changing modern world. After Bushnell's death in early 1876, Twitchell delivered eulogy sermons for him in Hartford and at Park Church here, in which he praised his mentor's unorthodox ministry as reaffirming, quote, a sign for doubters of every degree. He quotes two of Bushnell's maxims that I think influenced Twain as he began to write Adventures of Huckleberry Finn here at Quarry Farm just a couple of months later. Twitchell emphasized how Bushnell encouraged believers to be never afraid of doubt, as well as to never be in a hurry to believe, never try to conquer doubts against time. According to Twitchell, Bushnell asserted that prayerfully embracing and investigating one's doubts will ultimately help them to confirm divine truths. Now, Huck Finn, of course, is the embodiment of religious skepticism. Early on, he doesn't see where ancient biblical stories about dead people had any relevance for him, and he doubts Miss Watson's magical claims about prayer. Even so, Huck says that he is drawn to what he calls the widow's mouth-watering talk about providence, a desire which, according to Bushnell, would have left him open to overcoming his doubts eventually. And this happens after Huck fakes his death and runs away. As he hides on shore, watching the search party setting loaves of bread filled with quicksilver onto the water, which was a superstition believed to help locate drowned bodies in the river, one of the loaves floats over to where Huck is hiding. After the hungry boy picks up the bread from the water and begins to eat it, he reflects, I reckon the widow or the parson or somebody prayed that this bread would find me, and here it has gone and done it. So there ain't no doubt, which is an interesting word choice there, but there is something to that thing, or in that thing. So I also, in my book, will address the pivotal moment where Huck prays for help to turn Jim in as a runaway slave. And it's a very complicated, complex thing that I think also draws from religious liberalism, but it gets too involved for me to go into that right now. But suffice it to say, by the time Huckleberry Finn published in the early 1880s, Twain was moving toward the free religion end of the liberal theological spectrum, occupied by his progressive friend, Moncure Conway. Now, often Conway is referred in Mark Twain studies as Twain's literary representative in England, but he also happened to be one of his era's leading intellectuals, widely known for his theological and political radicalism. In fact, one historian has gone so far as to call Conway, quote, the most thoroughgoing white male radical produced by the antebellum South. Conway was from an aristocratic slave-owning family in Virginia, but he went on to become an outspoken egalitarian and abolitionist in the years leading up to the Civil War. He began his ministerial career as a Methodist circuit rider, but he eventually left the South to attend Harvard Divinity, where he studied under Emerson, and Emerson considered him his spiritual father. During the 1850s and 60s, abolitionism became an all-consuming passion for Conway. Shortly after the outbreak of the war, he personally encouraged President Lincoln to make abolishing slavery the conflict's main purpose. He believed so strongly in emancipation that Conway helped 31 of his father's slaves escape to Ohio. By the time Twain met him in 1872, Conway was a well-known lecturer and author living as an expatriate in London. He served there as minister of South Place Chapel, one of England's oldest free thought organizations. And according to an article I found from 1875, members of the congregation included graduates of Oxford, the president of the Royal Society of Philology, and the extreme left in politics and religion. In terms of his belief in God, Conway had an interesting way of looking at it. In that article, he's quoted as saying, "We have an instinct to render homage to a superior principle generally understood by the notion of God." But according to the author of the article, Conway resisted defining that notion for fear of enclosing it in some formula that on the morrow should prove at discord with the fresh verifications of science. It's a very long, roundabout way to discuss what he believed in God. Conway also left Unitarianism after concluding that Unitarians have done their utmost to make Christianity consistent with truth and freedom, but they have shown it is impossible. Now, among his very many unconventional religious interests was his research into demonology. In his 1879 book by that name, which Twain read and admired, Conway expressed a religious atheism similar to what his friend Max Muller advocated that I quoted earlier. And Conway noted that all great religions were born in this grand atheism, as the worship of Heracles meant the downfall of Zeus, the worship of Christ meant the overthrow of both Jove and Jehovah. Conway also admired what he referred to in his autobiography as his, quote, Gnostic Satan, the unfallen Satan of Job. And finally, Conway was one of the main popularizers of Hinduism in the West. As a student of Emerson at Harvard, he became enamored with Hinduism and lectured widely on the topic. In 1876, in fact, he resided with Twain and his family in Hartford when he lectured on Oriental religions at the Hartford Unitarian Society. He was particularly fond of the Bhagavad Gita and wrote often on the subject of Hindu avatars, or human manifestations of God, such as Krishna, but even, according to some Hindus, Jesus. In addition to sharing Conway's interest in demonology, Twain shared his interest in Hinduism as well. This list includes many influences that I've found that hope or possibly informed Twain's awareness of Hinduism, including his friend Tesla, whose scientific theories were influenced by Swami Vivekananda, the books that Twain had in his library on Hinduism, and two Indian practitioners of an esoteric Hindu philosophy called Advaita Vedanta, whom Twain met personally, one in his home in Hartford and one when he was on his lecture tour around the world in India. And there's much more I can say about all this, but you'll have to get the book when it comes out. But I'll conclude with examples of how I see Moncure Conway's orthodox interest in demonology and Hinduism influencing the supernatural characters in two of Twain's so-called dark writings that I've mentioned earlier, Letters from the Earth and number 44, The Mysterious Stranger. So in Letters from the Earth, whenever I bring this up, there's always inevitably someone who will say, well, what about Letters from the Earth? That proves that he was an atheist. And there is really good reason for this. If you've read the book, you know that the text contains, as I mentioned earlier, some of Twain's harshest criticisms of Christianity and God, and the narrator, after all, is Satan. However, it is important, in my opinion, in my interpretation, to remember that this Satan in Letters from the Earth is more like Moncure Conway's Gnostic Satan than the one depicted on this cover, which, in my opinion, represents more of the fallen angel and enemy of God type of Satan. So for Twain, in Letters from the Earth, Satan is actually an unfallen archangel, and he's a member of the heavenly court, where the Creator sits on his throne, quote, steeped in a glory of light and color, and thinks into existence what Twain poetically describes as a million stupendous suns, which clove the blackness and soared away and away and away, diminishing in magnitude and intensity as they pierced the far frontiers of space, until at last they were but as diamond nailheads sparkling under the domed vast roof of the universe. To me, I think some of his best and most poetic writing in that first chapter of the book. Now, the Satan in Letters from the Earth also reveres this Creator, and he refers to him as the Divine One. Although Satan is banished briefly from heaven for his sarcasm, the punishment is only for 1,000 years, which, in God's time, is merely a day. And he remains friends with his other archangel compatriots in heaven while he's out on his banishment. And these are the recipients of the letters that he writes while visiting God's newest creation, known as Earth. Now, Satan is appalled by what he finds there. One of his first complaints is how ridiculous human religion is. Satan, of course, knows and reveres the Creator, and he is from the, quote, illimitable continent of heaven, as Twain describes it. So therefore, his criticisms are aimed not at the Divine One, but at what Satan calls this race's God, the human race's God, and its feeble imagining of heaven, which he says is, quote, as quaint and naive a spectacle as has yet been imagined in this universe. So in my reading of Letters from the Earth, everything that Satan critiques following that, when it critiques Christianity, the Bible, this race's God, these are his attacks on the man-made religion that he finds here on earth, not the incomprehensible real Creator whose divine head blazed like a distant sun, in Twain's words from the book. So that's just one aspect of what I'm doing with that. And then with number 44, the mysterious stranger, as I've said earlier, there is no evidence suggesting that 44 is satanic, although that reputation still persists. In fact, I make the rather bold claim that he is actually God, or more precisely, he's an avatar of God. For example, you may remember Twain's reference in Innocents Abroad to Jesus as, quote, a mysterious stranger who was a God. I don't think Twain uses this term decades later in number 44's title, coincidentally. The supernatural visitor is, in fact, a lot like the Hindu avatars that intrigued Moncure Conway, who, like some Hindus, saw both Jesus and Krishna as human manifestations of the divine. Now, for example, when 44, that's the character, the mysterious stranger, he's got a numerical number, 44, when he first appears in Esseldorf in this version, in Twain's intended version, Twain gives him every trait that Jesus identifies with in Matthew chapter 25, verse 44, that's interesting, and 45, when he says that whatever you do to the least of these, you do unto him, Jesus. And 44 is a stranger, of course, and he is also described as hungry and thirsty. He's wearing tattered clothing, appears to be sickly, and is even accused by Esseldorf's false Christians as being a jailbird. Now, however, as the mercurial stranger evolves throughout the narrative, he takes on these traits of Krishna as well: a flamboyant and complex personality, a love of playing pranks and practical jokes, such as creating multiple versions of himself in the guise of other people, and a transformation into a light of 1,000 suns rising at once. And these traits parallel 44's increasingly gaudy attire, his opacity, and the duplicates he creates in Esseldorf, and his transfiguration also into a blazing light that is similar to what both Krishna and Jesus experience. But what about number 44's apparently nihilistic conclusion, in which the mysterious stranger reveals nothing exists, all is a dream. God, man, the world, the sun, the moon, the wilderness of stars, a dream, all a dream. They have no existence. At first glance, that does sound as if Twain has resigned himself to nihilism. However, when compared to the teachings of Sri 108, who was the guru that Twain met in India, it would appear to have something in common with the esoteric Hinduism that he taught as well. He taught the world is not real, it never existed, it does not exist, and it will not come into existence in future. We all dream, we are sleeping in the lap of ignorance, and as soon as true knowledge will dawn on us, we shall be able to know that the world is but a dream. So, and now, like 44, it is with this appalling insight that I, your poor servant, leave you, after first entertaining questions that you might have for me. So I thank you for your attention, and I hope this made some sense to you and gave you some food for thought.